by our cleverness, by our hard work, by whatever it is that we do. That's not where the world comes from. The creativity and generativity that's innate in the world and there and existing comes from God. And to remember that we are the created and not the creator is to keep ourselves to some degree in right relationship with God. So we could ask the question at the end of the first creation story, how does creation reflect its creator and respect its creator? How is the creation in right relationship? Well, it takes a day off. It keeps Sabbath because God did this. God took Sabbath and invites us to take Sabbath. So it's a relationship issue, and relationship will be key to some of our understanding of stewardship. And so we'll point this out now. Sabbath, of course, is told in a couple of other ways. It is a command in the 10 words, the 10 commandments, seen both in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5:12. And the Deuteronomistic scholar, of course, gives us commentary all through. I mean, really, it's a book of commentary on the law, and it's no different for the 10 words. The law, as prescribed in Deuteronomy 5. On keeping of Sabbath, there's commentary. Why should you keep the Sabbath? Well, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt. And what is it a slave can't do? A slave cannot choose to take a day off. Remember that God delivered you. And so keep the Sabbath. It's a way of remembering who you are and whose you are. It's a way of living into relationship. So Sabbath is portrayed for us there. Sabbath has another piece to it in the wilderness wanderings, which begin pretty quickly after we cross the Red Sea. In chapter 16, we have the story of the manna. Now, manna, you will remember, in Hebrew is from manhu, which translated best means, what is this? Or what the heck is this? When the manna appears, it's manhu. What is this? It is given as a gift of sustenance for the people who are hungry. And the Back to Egypt Committee, believe it or not, has already been formed. And so manna is given as a way of sustaining folks. And Sabbath ties into the manna story because what we learn is that if you take more than one day's provision of manna, more than one jar needed, what was needed for the day, it would become vomitous. It would rot. It would become wormy and vile. There's some wonderful dinner language for you, something you're going to eat, manna. And the whole jar of manna would be spoiled if you took more than you needed for that day, except on the Sabbath. Now then you could double up. You could take double portion on day 6 and have enough for day 7, and it miraculously would not spoil. Lots of things going on here, one of which, of course, is the idea of trusting God. The people are in this wilderness kiln to be tempered into trust, which they're really struggling to do. And keeping Sabbath is a way of trusting God. Taking only enough for each day is a way of trusting God, not trying to hoard. You know, hoarding is a lack of faith. It is closing the hand. It is trying to get all that we can, even perhaps at the expense of others, so our share is taken care of, and we just don't know about tomorrow. Well, this story tells us we don't need to worry about tomorrow. God's going to take care of tomorrow. We're going to hear Jesus tell us that in the Sermon on the Mount when we move into Second Testament understandings of stewardship. But here's an echo of give us today our daily bread, and important for us to note. So if you don't trust that there'll be enough for tomorrow and you hoard, you end up losing it all. That's bad. If you trust that on the day before the Sabbath you can take a double portion and it won't go bad and you'll have enough for that day, that's good. And it's preserved, and then the cycle starts over. Now Sabbath, there are many other places where Sabbath comes into play for us. I'm just going to lift up one other, and that's in the book of Leviticus, but it is repeated many times in Deuteronomy. But in Leviticus 25, 1 through 17 is an explanation about Sabbath for the land. You see, Sabbath doesn't just apply to the human creature, and we'll learn it doesn't just apply to those creatures in the employment of the human creature for service and industry that the human creatures husband and take care of, but it's also for the land itself, that the land is to lay fallow at the end of 6 years. It's to have a Sabbath rest. And the Jubilee then is talked about here in this portion of Leviticus as well. The idea that after 7 sets of Sabbath, after 49 years of this cycle, that there would be a year of Jubilee, a year of the land returning to its original owners, of those who are in debtor's prison being set free. Remarkable imagery and hope. The very thing that we think it is that Jesus is proclaiming has come with his coming in the Gospel of Luke, as Luke tells us that story. But Leviticus 25 is important for us, that the land gets rest. I will tell you about my Lutheran neighbor who, when I was in seminary, I'd been a city kid all my life. I had had no experience really with anything that was remotely farming. And in my student church, which was in west central Indiana, I got an education in farming and animal husbandry and parts of the world at work that I didn't know anything about. And my Lutheran neighbor taught me about giving the land Sabbath. He had a cycle, a rotation for his crops. He just didn't plant corn in the field that was behind the parsonage year after year, even though it was wonderful soil for corn. It would yield somewhere upwards of 150 bushel an acre, which is great soil for corn. But Louis didn't plant corn every year. Louis planted corn one year, and then he planted soybeans, and then he planted winter wheat, and then he planted timothy, clover, and alfalfa, and let the land kind of rest. And he would mow that, sell the timothy and alfalfa to his neighbor, and clover, who had some animals, and he'd bale that. But at the beginning of the next year, he would turn all of that over, and it would go back into feeding the soil. And he understood, you see, that it didn't matter how much chemical you dumped on something, the cutworms would keep coming back every year if you kept planting corn. But if you waited about 4 years before you planted corn again, the cutworms all died off in the soil and all their progeny, and you could get another crop without having to use so much chemical. And by allowing the land to gradually rest from corn, which pulled the most from the soil, he didn't have to put as much chemicals in terms of nutrients and nitrogen into the soil, saving himself money, but also being a good steward and allowing the land to kind of heal itself and recover. It wasn't a 7-year cycle, but it was a cycle nonetheless that understood the admonition and instruction in Leviticus. And this is a huge faith and stewardship issue, not only in care for the earth, but imagine just for a minute what it takes to let a Sabbath year happen. For 6 years you pull from that land. In the 6th year, you have to get not only enough harvest to sustain you in the 7th, but also enough seed so that you can plant when the cycle starts over again, year 1 or year 8 linear. That takes some real faith and some real trust. But this is what God says, and in Deuteronomy, here's this word again, God basically says, if you don't do this, if you don't take care of the land, if you don't do these things I'm instructing you to do, the land will vomit you out. Wow. You look at what's going on in our soil and our water, and issues related to the rise in global temperatures. Is the land vomiting us out? Have we failed to keep Sabbath? Have we failed to exercise our dominion appropriately? Have we failed at protecting and serving the garden? I think it's a legitimate question for us to ask, and it is a big piece of understanding stewardship. I'm going to move on to the tithe, because I think when we think stewardship, that's probably the first place our mind runs. If we ask our people in church, what do you think of when I say the word stewardship? 9 times out of 10, they will think of that 3-week campaign every year where we're raising money for next year's budget. Or they will think of money. They will think of the tithe, and most folks know the tithe. They know that it's 10%, but most folks, including many clergy I know, don't know the story of the tithe. And I think it's very important that we revisit it. It is told to us a couple of times. Once again, the book of Deuteronomy, told once with minor commentary and once with significant commentary, and I want to look at those and have us explore those. In Deuteronomy 14:22, it says, "Set apart a tithe of the yield of your seed that is brought in yearly from the field, in the presence of the Lord your God, in the place God will choose as a dwelling place for his name. You shall eat the tithe of your grain, your wine, and your oil, as well as the firstlings of your herd, so that you may fear the Lord your God always." Did you hear that? You bring in the tithe, and it's a tithe of everything that includes not just the seeds, but the wine and the oil and the firstlings of the herd, and you have a party. You have a potluck supper. Everybody bring a dish to share. It is a remarkable understanding that most of us don't have, that the giving of the tithe, this one of many different kinds of offerings a faithful Jewish person would make in their lifetime, this first fruits offering given every year, is meant to be a celebration so that you will fear the Lord your God always, so that you will remember where this bounty comes from, what the providence is that is given to you, that it's from the hand of God, and you'll remember that. You'll remember that you are creation, not creator, and that you are sustained by the good and generous blessing of God. The land yields because God wills it to be so, and you come and you celebrate and remember. Now the text goes on to tell us that if when the Lord your God has blessed you, the distance is so great you're unable to transport it, because the place where the Lord God will choose to set his name is too far from you. All of this anticipating the temple cult and Jerusalem. Then you may turn it into money, and with the money secure in hand, go to the place that the Lord your God will choose. And here's the good part. Spend the money for whatever you wish. Oxen, sheep, wine, strong drink, or whatever you desire. Now read that to your good Baptist friends. You shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your household, rejoicing together. The tithe is in this telling a celebration, a remembrance of the goodness of God, done with the whole community brought together to rejoice at how fortunate we are that God provides for us what we need. And once again, the year was successful, the harvest came, and from the bounty, from the abundance, there is enough that I can give 10% and still have enough left over to sustain in the moment and move to generativity in the future. Do you hear all of that? It's latent. It's latent in the text. It's there for us to see and explore. That great promise is in there for us. You can take off 10% and live on the 90 and never miss it. There's some instruction for us and some wisdom for us. In Deuteronomy 26, the story is told again in verses 1 through 11. And this time, while you will note immediate similarities, there are some significant differences that I want to point out. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and you settle it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground which from the harvest, from the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put it in a basket, and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling place for his name.